Welcome to the second episode of MyLife, Chassidus Applied. I must say the overwhelming response and positive response has really been very moving, and I'm very happy to say that questions have been coming in from every direction, covering every possible topic. So I thank you for your kind words and supporting words, and continue to keep the questions coming. You can write to us, complete confidence, completely anonymously, at a form that we created on the page in meaningfullife.com/mylifelive. Because we had all these different questions, and the different questions fit into all different types of categories, as I'm organizing the categories, I think the best way to approach this is to actually take different categories and address them week after week. The thing is that since every category has many subcategories, it's impossible in the span of the time allowed for us to really cover everything, obviously, in a thorough way. So I felt that it's important to cover some serious and more comprehensive topics. For example, the topic of Shalom Bayis, harmony at home, has so many different subsets. Issues of parnasa, livelihood, issues of intimacy, issues dealing with children, the different struggles that families have and couples have. So we'll be focusing on one element of it in this session, and hopefully in the coming weeks address different aspects of it. So rest assured that your questions will all be addressed one way or the other. We're looking at all of them, and I'm really organizing them in a proper way. So because of some of the topics we talked about last week were evoked many different responses, I felt that it's important to elaborate a bit on some of those, and of course on the new topics that we announced. So, namely, the topics that were most interesting to people were addiction, the issue of Kabbolos Ohl, healthy versus unhealthy, bittul and Kabbolos Ohl, and the issue of the emotional relationship of Chassidus to our emotional development. So I'll be talking a bit about that, and then we'll be covering actually, hopefully, a piece on Shalom Bayis. We'll do something about narcissism, chinuch and education, dealing with difficult challenges with children, a piece on depression, and addition to what I've just said. I want to add one more thing. The approach of Chassidus to issues, as I mentioned briefly last time, and I want to just embellish upon that, is not just a quick fix or a band-aid. It's about a way of life. A way of life that's meant to empower us to stand on our own feet and not be dependent on anyone. Obviously on God, but be able to find the resources within ourselves to deal with any particular issue. And as such, in each of these episodes, I hope to take emphasize one Chassidic theme that shows that type of empowerment and approach, a Chassidic approach. So besides actually addressing the questions with that in mind, also to actually take such a tool. So we can slowly build a tool chest, if you wish, of different methods that Chassidus teaches us to address issues. Now when I say Chassidus, I just want to make sure everyone understands Chassidus is Torah, given at Har Sinai. It was revealed to us in the last generations, but it's one and the same as Torah. Chassidus is Primus Torah, revealed in the last generations to deal with the challenges of our times and to prepare us for Mashiach. So, we're following up some of the questions that were asked last week. I'll begin with that. I'd like to read something which really, I actually hesitated initially to read because it was painful actually to read, but I think it's important to mention it because I think it resonates with many people. And it's a challenge actually to why we're doing this in the first place. So the writer writes, excuse the tone of some of what follows. Tanya Perek Aleph, Vav Zayin and Ches seem to produce primarily a feeling of guilt in almost everything we do. When you include Perek Gimel, they also hammer the point that, in spite of the stated goal on the Sharblat, which means that everything should be relevant, Karve Lecha, it is all pretty much out of reach. I don't believe the Alter Rebbe had this in mind. Over the years, I've developed my own concepts to present these Perakim, these chapters in a positive mode. I have no idea if I'm correct. But Chaz v'Shalom, they should address this in yeshiva? Why should we be in the dark about such fundamentals? Is Chassidus only about Kabbolos Ohl? The way they, not the Rabbeim, keep hacking it all the time, meaning the teachers, you would think it was. However, even not being a Chassid can also have Kabbolos Ohl. I don't see why you need Chassidus for that. Lest you say, Reishis Aveda v'ikra v'sharsha, which the Alter Rebbe says in chapter 41, I point out the Alter Rebbe waited till Perek Mem Aleph, chapter 41, to bring up that subject. Yes, it is true that Hashem has nachas from our struggles, but I believe that the Tanya's eitzes, advice, are not designed to keep us as tension-filled, guilt-ridden, I'll force myself all the time type of living zombies. Why should we be in the dark about such fundamentals? And what about Avos Hashem? Is that all the way out of my league? Somehow I doubt it. But that's how it's presented to us, it seems. What does Avos Hashem mean for people like us? I've again developed my own thoughts. I don't know if I'm right. Why should we be in the dark about such fundamentals? Now, on one hand, why I hesitated reading it, because it's painful to hear that Tanya, Chassidus, for people who clearly know and have studied it, seems to be not relevant, when the whole basis of it was relevance. But at the same time, it's important that people are articulating this, and I felt it's important to mention, to just reinforce the importance of what we're doing right here. So with that said, I want to go over to the topic that has been repeated time and again, and simply because people continue to ask the question, I think it's important to start with, and that is the issue of Kabbolos Ohl. Now, last week, in the first part, I attempted to talk about overall general subjects, and my goal is to begin to get into specifics. But obviously some specifics are more general than others, so please bear with me. So the question about Bittul and Kabbolos Ohl. So here's one question that was asked. What does Chassidus mean to be bottle? And why doesn't it contradict the idea of self-esteem, the feeling that I matter? Another question, doesn't Kulik Hamei Kala Chashiv, when you say that everything is nullified before God, doesn't that mean I'm worthless in the eyes of God? Can it be interpreted, albeit a novel meaning, a novel interpretation, that it means nothing can get in the way between my relationship with God? But that's not the seemingly obvious interpretation. So how do we understand this? Now I know I addressed it. Clearly the questions came in after I addressed it, so it needs more explanation. So let's take a scenario, which I believe is a very common scenario in many circles, and that scenario goes like this. A person, for example, Rahman al-Islam, God forbid, grew up in a home, an abusive home, where the parents were angry, dysfunctional, absentee. I'm painting the worst case scenario. And that's not say the worst case scenario, a bad scenario. And a child was beat up, never was able to feel the nurturing and the confidence. Every time the child voiced something, had an opinion, the child was silenced. The insecure parents created an insecure child. And mixed into the bag, this child was also brought up in a Chassidic school, where they taught that God is the greatest thing and all of us are nullified completely in front of that God. So clearly, this child sees those ideas that are being taught as reinforcing the shmata, the doormat, the self-loathing, low self-esteem individual that he's turned into. So let's imagine this scenario. Hopefully it's not that common. Unfortunately it's common. Hopefully not very common, but it's common. So obviously a person like that is going to ask a question. You tell me about God and how we are all nullified in the eyes of God. Nothing exists but God. My entire existence, l'shamis is kaini. Nothing but to serve God. Obviously for a person like that, God and the concept of subjugation to God is filled with negativity. Let's take another scenario. A child growing up in a home, the opposite. A home where he or she was nurtured, loved unconditionally. All the time. And not just said in lip service. Felt that way. Grows up confident, secure, ready to take on the world. And that same child was taught, Eined Mulvad, nothing exists but God. How will that child, adult, the turning an adult, look at the same concept? I think its answer is pretty obvious. He won't see it as a contradiction, because if you're secure, and you're a person that feels that you valued, and you hear that I am nullified before God, it doesn't make you suddenly have no self-esteem, because you have ingrained in you, embedded in you, in every part of your life, that aspect of love. So now, what's the solution to this problem? Back to scenario one. One option could be, listen, you've been hurt, by your parents, you've been hurt by the system, you've been hurt by educators, by mashpim, everybody. Everybody has hurt you. You're now a self-loathing, shriveled up individual who's afraid of their own shadow. Okay. One option is, since Chassidus, since Torah was used to beat you up, it was used to reinforce your shiflus, that you're worthless, you have to that you have to now reclaim yourself. And you cannot use any of those forces that helped diminish you, because they're part of your poison. So you have to reclaim yourself. You have to find ways to reclaim that self. That's one approach. And even if it takes rejecting the authorities, because those authorities or similar authorities were used to belittle you or destroy your self-esteem, that so be it. At this stage of the game, that's what healing requires. A second option, which of course I'm submitting here, is what Chassidus says. Fine. Let's make a very strong disclaimer, make it very clear that someone beat you up and made you feel like worthless. That has nothing to do not with Torah, not with Chassidus, not with Yiddishkeit. Simply an insecure person who happens to be walking around Nabekesha, or happens to look like a religious person. You know, I'm not looking for a scapegoat, but why apply and say that that's the Torah? Now, how do we heal from that? You heal from that as knowing that. And now let's take a shtikl Chassidus, let's take a Maimer, let's take a piece of Tanya, let's take a Gemara, whatever it may be, and let's learn it the right way. So really it comes down to how you learn it and who's teaching it to you. If it's coming from a person who exudes love to you and care, and you feel it in every word the person is saying, then you're receptive. If you feel that you're still in the line of fire and the same Ashbiyah who's belittled you is now saying, you know what, let's learn it a different way, you're untrusted. That's the Chassidic approach. We don't have to reject the whole thing because some of us have been hurt by it. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You find where the sensitive points are and you learn it the right way. So to say I have to reject Kabbolos Ohl because it was contaminated is not a Chassidic approach. Yeah. Now, case by case, which is why I make this disclaimer again and again, no way that this is an adequate forum to deal with personal issues, customized and individualized. This you need specifically to talk to a Rav, a Mashpia, a professional, all together, because you have to customize and relate to these ideas one-on-one that can only be done individually. Individually, your particular authority, Torah authority, may have a particular formula or method to be able to help you grow through this. But a total rejection of saying I'm reclaiming the self is not healthy. Why is it not healthy? Because who's going to give you now the self? Let's say your parents didn't give it to you. The system didn't give it. Who's going to give it to you? Who? Friends? Okay, they could be supportive. And this brings me to the concept of bittul. From a Chassidic point of view, bittul is not annihilation. The way I would translate it, and this is of course a key thing, the way the words that we learn them, the way that we're taught, are said mechanically in words that don't resonate. Bittul means suspension of self in light of something that's far greater and higher than yourself. When a parent stays up all night because they love their child and the child can't sleep or is not well, that's bittul. Is that annihilation of the parent? It's love that overlooks my particular comfort for something greater. That's what bittul is. Suspension of self in face of something greater. I heard once that the Rebbe said an expression, bittul kenish bottle werden. So actually bittul is the key to immortality. Why? Because anyone who comes and says, let's reclaim yourself, what are they going to give you? A man-made device that itself is mortal. How much value can you get if your parents took away your value? God forbid, abusive parents. So someone else, a healthy adult, will give you what? Value that a human being can give you. How long can that last? Bittul, on the other hand, is eternal. When the Jews gave their lives for their faith, that was bittul. They did it with strength, not out of weakness. And that was a strength because they believed you can take our bodies, but you can't take our souls. You can take our lives, but you can't take our faith. And if it's not us, it will be the next generation. So the concept of Kabbolos Ohl is all about you matter. Now, Kula Kamei Kalach Hashiv is misunderstood. When you say that you're nullifying the face of God, you know what you're saying? You're saying that the mortal world, Gashmias, that dies, everything is dying and everything is eroding, cannot face up in the face of eternity. So we have two options. We're mortals, God is immortal, and the mortal is nullified in the face of immortality. Or, and this is the gift that God gave us, He says, I am giving you a gift called immortality. I'm giving you a piece of myself. Whatever words you want to use. I am giving you a piece of myself, and now a mortal creation has immortality. But there's a condition. If you're going to focus on your material, temporary, impermanent needs, and that means yourself is expressing itself that way, then you've written your own script. How long can that last? As long as money lasts, as long as food lasts, as long as anything in this material world lasts. However, when you have bitl and Kabbolos Ohl to something that's immortal, you dedicated yourself to a cause that's greater than your own mortal needs, then you have immortality. You tell me, which one would you choose? Which is more self? So it's clear that self can be obliterated by individuals that obliterate. But the whole yesod of Chassidus is that God gave us a piece of immortality. Not for arrogant purposes, not for us to feel, oh, now I'm so valuable. We're part of the big picture. And we have that ability. Now, I hope this helped. Obviously, we've got to move on. There's more to say. But let's move on to the next question that was asked. It was around the nature of what Chassidus is, the actual nature of Chassidus. According to Chassidus, how do we understand the difference of the roles played by the mind and the heart, the cognitive and the emotional, and psychological matters? Now, some of you may be familiar with the concept of cognitive dissonance or emotional dissonance. The word dissonance means disconnect. That, for example, you understand something, but you don't act on it. There's some type of disconnect. Now you could have a cognitive disconnect, where your mind simply doesn't want to go there. Or your mind goes there, but your heart doesn't want to go there. It's two types of disconnects. Whether this is Timtum HaMeach and Timtum HaLev and Chassidus is arguable. Some say that Timtum HaMeach, Timtum HaLev is a far more spiritual type of problem. But it definitely has similarities to that. Timtum means blocked. Something blocks the mind. Something blocks the heart. So to address this issue, and I think it's a very critical issue because it also is a klal, a yesod, a foundation that addresses a bunch of other issues. So everything is hashgacha pratis, everything is divine providence. Sometimes to appreciate something, you have to look at the contrast. So some of you may know, and this is documented in Beis Rebbe. Beis Rebbe, written by Rav Hillman, he writes that in the time of the Alter Rebbe, of course, there was the machlekes of Misnagdim with the Chassidim, but then within the Chassidim there was also a machlekes, an argument. So even though initially the Alter Rebbe was very close with Rabbi Avram Kalisker and Baruch Mezhebuzer, who was an Einikul, a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, yet at some point, especially when Avram Kalisker went to Eretz Yisrael, so the way he writes it there, that he heard a lot of Lashon Hara and he believed it, and he began to have a complaint against Alter Rebbe Shita. We're not going to get into all the details of it, but there's a critical point. What was his complaint? And as we'll soon see, the Alter Rebbe ignored it until the bubble burst, and the Alter Rebbe had to address it in a long letter to Rabbi Avram, a sharp letter. The basic taina, he felt that the Alter Rebbe wandered, Chassidus Chabad, the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus Chabad wandered away from the Nekuda of the Baal Shem Tov. What was the point of the Baal Shem Tov? The Baal Shem Tov came in a time where there were a lot of Torah scholars, but there was a disconnect, a dissonance between learning and acting. Lacking Ahavas Yisrael, a split between the classes, the elite and the simple. What did the Baal Shem Tov do? He awakened Yisrael, he awakened the neshama, the power of the soul, the power of a simple Baruch Hashem, the power of a simple prayer. Amunah pshuta. Now, what did the Baal Shem Tov do for his early part of his life? He was like he walked children to school and got them to instilled in them Yiras Shamayim, Ahavas Hashem, Amunah. So he claimed that real Chassidus is getting that spark going and feeling it, emotions. Alter Rebbe in Chassidus Chabad, he started developing Chassidus Chabad, became a whole series of discourses and required effort. It became like a scholarship, inaccessible to these Anoshim Pshutim. Instead of sparking that soul, the whole learning of it, in a sense, in his opinion, obfuscated the Nekudas Yahadus, the Pintal Yid, that the Baal Shem Tov came to awaken. One example given for this was that Chabad offers a pistol, a gun, with gunpowder, with bullets, with everything, but the spark is lacking. The Alter Rebbe initially ignored these tainas, but finally he responded in a very strong and sharp letter to Rabbi Avram Kalisker, and he made several key points. And these key points, I believe, are critical to understanding Chassidus' relevance to our lives today. The key points are: number one, the Alter Rebbe says, briefly, Amunah alone, and he brings the Gemara, Gam v'apu machtarta rachmana karya, is dissonance. If you have faith alone, yes, it's a spark, but you can't live on a spark. It's what Chassidus calls makif. You can have Amunah and then pray to God to help you steal, which is just an example, it can be used in any situation. Whereas Pnimius is through learning. The second point he made, that emotions, for them to be healthy, cannot just be based on an emotional experience, they have to be guided and shaped and given birth to from seichel. The third point he made was midas alone, emotion alone, is hergesh atzmei. It ultimately is about your feelings. Whereas the mind keeps a certain reflective objectivity. And he brought the tides, v'yadaita hayim v'ashavesa levecha. Why does it say v'yadaita hayim? Doesn't say, should have said v'yadaita v'ashavesa hayim, or v'yadaita shavesa levecha hayim. Why is the hayim on v'yadaita? That today you should know, and then afterwards it says, and then it will enter, penetrate, or return your heart. He says, because today, the work today, is in the mind. Famous other Torah from the Alter Rebbe, that it doesn't say v'hasidesi leva, it says v'hasidesi leva even. I will remove your heart of stone, and I will give you a heart of flesh. Why doesn't it say v'hasidesi leva me'ach? The mind also could be blocked, because the mind is in our control. So the way to the heart in our time is primarily through contemplation and taka learning, elokus, chassidus, and that will awaken the emotion. And he goes on to say, the Alter Rebbe actually, that if we don't learn chassidus, Mashiach will come, we're going to have to start learning from Aleph Beis, because we won't know what he's talking about. He's going to be teaching Pnimius HaTorah. We have not learned it. To just go with Amunah and with a Hergish is not Yediyah, is not knowledge, it's not internalized. And a few other reasons that he gave in this context. Why am I using it for our discussion? Because in psychology, and I very qualified that Chassidus is beyond psychology, but it's also psychology, and in its ability to be mavada, refine the human being, our minds and our hearts, expresses the essence of Chassidus. What is the bottom line? The bottom line is for your mind to connect to something. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes in the name of the Rebbe Rashab, in a Maimer Podav Shalom Tofresh Pei Hei. I suggest everyone look at that. He says that the Alter Rebbe's Chiddush was to take a lakus and to put it into Hasagi and Seichel. And that means it gives us the ability to transform our personalities, our teva, the nature of our personalities and of the world, to lakus. Why the mind? Because with the mind, we internalize things. Imagine somebody, we had no medicine and no science, and we just went by whim. By whim, it's guesswork. The mind allows you to integrate something. If you go by faith alone, and by emotions alone, it's not integrated into the spirit and the being of a human being. But here we have the problem. You can learn Chassidus and be disconnected, and just have cognitive dissonance, which is why the Alter Rebbe says that the mind will lead to the emotions, which is its separate Aveda. Because we see people who know Chassidus very well, but they don't have any emotional intelligence, which is of course a big part of what we're discussing. So how does this apply to us? It applies to us the following: that Chassidus is a fusion of mind and emotional work. In Peidik Tes of Tanya, which is here is one of the fundamental principles, Alter Rebbe identifies the human being. Everyone can relate to this. And I'm going to use plain English without any words from the Peidik and Tanya. He says we have two parts to us. One is a reflective mind, and one is an impulsive heart. Very different. When your impulses are working, your mind is blotted out. Think of a telemarketer calls you and says, listen, I have something to sell to you. And if they know how to manipulate your emotions, they can get you to buy something that's worthless. And if they say to you, and you say, let me reflect on this, I'll get back to you tomorrow. They say, no, if you don't get it right now, you don't grab this bargain, You won't have the opportunity tomorrow. They don't want you to think about it. How many mistakes would we avoid in responding to people that, for example, provoke us, in quick decisions, if we just reflected over it overnight? How many passions, how many mistakes, how many sins even, would we avoid if we just reflected? We get caught in the moment of passion, we get caught in the moment that we're completely consumed and obsessed with something, and that takes over. The heart takes over, the blood of the heart rushes to the mind, and it uses the mind to fulfill whatever impulse and desire the heart has. The key is the mind. The mind is the brakes that says, 1 second, I got to reflect on this. I'm not buying a shmata. I'm not going to take this candy and eat it because maybe it's poison. I don't care how much someone can manipulate me, I need to reflect. And this is a foundation of Chassidus Chabad. Now the mind is not because we're trying to be intellectual and escape into the cerebral, which is cognitive dissonance. It's because the mind is a researcher. The mind is reflective. It's dispassionate at its best. It can't run your life. Life is run on the level of emotions. So what we are dealing with is a Chassidus, that some people have learned Chassidus and they have a cognitive connection to it, but it's dissonance. And then there are people who have emotional dissonance. The key is both. The mind, all it is like the captain of a ship. A person cannot just live on a mind. The Frierdiker Rebbe once said that a maskil walks on his head and a Avid walks on his feet. So the idea of a mind is meant to simply be a navigator. It's like research. The mind checks it out and then the heart can come and experience it. This is how Chassidus works. So this is a complete system of helping people deal with a situation. You analyze your problem, whatever it may be, and that leads you to then act on it and come up with an emotional game plan. So if a person just reflected and said, you know what, I feel desperate. We're going to talk in a moment about the depression, anxiety. I feel desperate. If you can just reflect and step back, you don't have to act. It's the first step. What happens? You bring in a patient into a hospital, the first thing you have to stop the bleeding. And then analyze before you intervene, before you first diagnose, before you suggest some type of intervention. So that is the question about this, deals with the question of mind and heart. Now, let me move over to just to the question of, let me just get all my questions here. Shalom Bayis, which everything leads into the question. There are many different subcategories about Shalom Bayis. The one I want to talk about is a question that was asked like this. Where is the following sourced in Chassidus? The need for two individuals to be emotionally healthy, for them to have a healthy marriage. A second questioner continues the question in a somewhat different context, but a similar idea, and says, I've heard from Mashpiyim and from others that for Shalom Bayis, and let's define Shalom Bayis means there be harmony between husband and wife, between spouses. There has to be an element where they don't focus on their needs, and if they just have a Chassidic connection, it will solve most of their problems. Those that focus on emotional connections and focus on their relationship, as so many therapists suggest doing, communicating and talking, actually does not solve the problem. It just dwells on the problem instead of just overlooking issues. Is this correct or incorrect is the question. So in an interesting way, it's a very much of an overlap question to the concept of Kabbolos Ohl. Is Kabbolos Ohl enough, for example, in a marriage? If two people have complete bittul and they don't think about themselves, they're dedicated to each other and to their family and to their children, and they'll never think about themselves. Is this what is expected in a Chassidic relationship? And if it is, the writer asks, and if I don't have it, then what do I do? It just doesn't work for me that way. So an excellent question. I think it's a good foundation to what Shalom Bayis is and so on. How much is the self in this relationship? So I think we have to go back to the Chumash itself to answer this question, to Chumash, and to not just Chassidus but also Nigla, the Talmud, and so on. Because there are halachas that talk about this. Before we get into the deeper dimension, let's start with the pasuk. The pasuk says that God created the human being, Zachar Nekeva, one entity, an androgynous creature, then split them into two, and that's where they look for each other. So what you have right there is that the concept of love and ave, which is a prerequisite in marriage, al pi halacha, is a holy concept. Is the concept of two entities joining. When the Rambam says that Shir HaShirim was written, the romantic song of songs, is a mashal for God and the Jewish people. So what do you have? That means that the relationship between God and the Jewish people is like a husband and a wife. And it goes both ways. That means a husband and wife reflect what a relationship between us and God has to be like. So to suggest that a relationship does not have a whole dynamic element, that it's just two blind people who are putting aside all their needs and there's no self, would basically say that a relationship with God is also that way, which is of course incorrect. According to Chassidus Chabad especially, a relationship is a complete relationship. We call shutef lakadosh baruch hu b'ma'aseh bereishis. We're partners with God. As spouses are partners with each other. Now obviously you need to have a key foundation is bittul. You don't have any bittul, two people cannot get along with each other. Men and women are very different. But that does not mean or preclude a relationship, an emotional relationship. Which is why you find halacha after halacha that talks how husband and wife have to speak to each other, how they have to be intimate with each other, how that's done. It's not a mechanical thing. It's absolutely an emotional thing. Now where the challenge is, and the problem is, that in the secular world in which we live, yes, there could be a complete focus completely on needs, on sexual needs, on other needs, without a foundation called bittul. So then, of course, you're in for trouble. Because how long can two people's needs continue to complement each other? And then you find your needs can be met elsewhere. But a relationship is something that you work on. Kasha k'kriyas yamsuf, like the Ragachover says, every second kedushin is ampul and nimshachas, because to keep two people together requires a constant force that keeps them together. In simple English, it means a relationship cannot be going to automatic pilot. You have to work on it. Just like a relationship with God can't go into automatic pilot. And here I refer you to chapter 15 in Tanya. And there again, don't use the Hebrew. With one point in the whole chapter. Automatic pilot doesn't work. It works for a while. A mechanical Jew, like he says there, someone who studies Torah 100 times, repeats the same Gemara, is called lo yavodei. It's as if you didn't serve God. The one time that you change your nature, you do something different, something unique, that's called Eved Elikim, Eved Hashem, a servant of God. Because it's not taken for granted. You don't go into automatic situations. A marriage, a relationship is the best example for a situation where you cannot take anything for granted. Obviously, as I said, there are times you have to go into automatic situation. So a foundation to Shalom Bayis, and of course we'll talk about this a lot more, and I absolutely want to qualify, this does not cover by any means the bigger issues, but it's a context which upon we can build many different ideas and approaches to Shalom Bayis, knowing this. Shalom Bayis is not one person, it's two people, a man and a woman, like two circles. They come together, and one does not annihilate the other, and they become greater, they become a Tzelem Elikim. And that requires both respect for each other, love for each other, yes, a measure of foundational bittul, where they're ready to go beyond their needs at times, but at the same time, closeness also means getting their needs met. If your relationship is built purely on getting needs met, it usually will not succeed for long. But if it's built on the foundations I just described, and you get your needs met, then as I said, bittul vet nishbatel, that's the secret to a binyan adayad. More to come on this topic. Okay. I want to move to the next question. Next question is dealing with a narcissistic partner, sibling, or child. I am at total loss dealing with a marriage that can hardly be called that. My life is lonely and devoid of any empathy. Everything, including family, is a focus on himself, meaning on her husband. Married life is devoid of joy and beauty, of a friendship and expression of love. He loves himself. He's a real charmer. I do not understand, in living a committed Torah Chassidic shlichus life, how al pi Torah someone can inflict so much pain on another. Sans the spirit of the law and the ksuba. This is not a new issue, but it is constant. He withholds information, I know nothing. Whatever he does for me feels like charity. Now, I intentionally took a harsher, so-called, a more blunt note, because I want to demonstrate also that nothing is off limits. We'll address everything as best of my ability. I just want to begin, first of all, an answer to a question like this requires more than something I could say to a larger audience online. This woman needs someone to talk to, one-on-one, in confidence, privately, someone who has empathy, someone who understands the situation, and understands also the people involved. And I want to just say this as a rule. I never give advice through a third party. If someone tells me they know two people that have this situation, I always say, are they ready to speak to me? Then I'll speak to them. Or find someone else to speak to. Because a third party always will somewhat maybe miss something. You need to understand the picture before addressing it. Now, I'm not suggesting that anything written here is untrue. But there's usually more to every situation. I would like to know what the husband would say. Not necessarily that he's right or she's right, but to intervene in a picture where there's a husband and wife, and a wife is describing a miserable marriage like this, you need to understand the dynamic. So this is a method. This is a method. You see it. I recently saw a video. The Rebbe speaks about parents are coming to the Rebbe in one of the Yechidus by Machne Yisrael, and they're talking about their daughter who's dating somebody. And you can see the Rebbe keeps talking about that they should not intervene, and that this girl has to be given a certain strength so she'll be able to deal with her own issues. It's very difficult to give advice from a distance. And yet I will say a few points here. Anyone in such a situation must reach out for help. Do not feel that it's all hopeless, because every situation could be bettered. You need to look at it with fresh eyes. And often we get stuck in our own, what we call the known evil versus the unknown evil. And we get resigned. And the resignation doesn't help you move forward, which we shall soon talk about when we talk about depression and anxiety. So number one is, you must bring in fresh air. Every infection in the world festers when there's no fresh air. You need fresh air to heal. Fresh air means a new perspective, a new friend, someone to talk to. Since this was written to me, for the venture, the initiative that we began here, if you feel comfortable speaking to me, I'll be happy to speak. Doesn't have to be me. Find someone you can speak to. Now, as far as narcissism itself, let's assume this is an accurate description of the partner, of the husband. You know, narcissism, there is of course clinical narcissism, which sometimes needs real professional assistance. But most narcissism is a process where a person begins to just, it begins slowly, and then you become a narcissist. Narcissism is not such an easy thing to deal with, because no one likes to admit that they're a narcissist. An alcoholic, at some point they hit rock bottom, say, I'm an alcoholic, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. These are things people admit. It's very hard. Very rarely someone will come into a room and say, hey, I'm a narcissist. That's why you don't have Narcissist Anonymous. Maybe you do. I haven't heard of it. Because nobody comes and just says, hey, I've been a narcissist now for 6 years, I'm trying to change that. Now, sometimes, so how does someone get out of that? You have to always find an opening. Narcissism is usually a byproduct of insecurity, where a person feels the only way that they have value, or the only way that they control, is when it's all about me, me, me. It's often a result of seeing that in your family. There's all kinds of usual suspects that we can identify. But obviously, it goes right into the face of what Chassidus says. You know what a narcissist is? A narcissist is the epitome, the ultimate of a person that has no bittul. If you want to know what's not bittul, a narcissist. Self, self, self. He could say he's reclaimed himself, but at the expense of everybody else, and also at the expense of himself ultimately. You have a narcissist, you have to find an opening. Sometimes a narcissist has to really suffer, God forbid, get into a situation that they're so hurt that wakes them up. I don't wish that upon anybody. So narcissism is the ultimate of what yeshus is. Yeshus is sometimes defined as arrogance, but narcissism is more than arrogance. Narcissism is almost an all-prevalent type of state of mind that everything is about me. You can tell a narcissist in 2 minutes of a conversation, especially a compulsive narcissist, any conversation you have with that type of person, always will, somewhere the I is going to come in. You could be talking to them about landing on the moon, and they'll suddenly say, oh yeah, I know somebody from NASA. Who's talking about you? We're talking about landing on the moon. What does that have to do with you? But it is ultimately a form of insecurity that is sad and needs to be addressed. So I just respond to this person and say, this is something you must speak to someone about, first of all, to get your own comfort, and then see what can be done here. And all situations can be handled. That's a critical component, because as soon as we become resigned and we feel hopeless, that's when that itself becomes a secondary problem, which is of course a central theme as well in Chassidus. That's why there's always Vayiso. The Jews came between the Yam, the sea, and the Egyptians pursuing them. What was the ultimate answer? Not war, not suicide, not resignation, not prayer. Answer, Vayiso, move forward. Moving is critical. Better move and make a mistake than remain paralyzed in your situation. That is the first step, the fresh air that I mentioned, that starts freeing things. This topic I will talk about some more, because there are many questions about narcissism. I wanted to just cover it in this context, a little Shalom Bayis related. Now, I didn't discuss sibling or child, narcissism of a child. That deserves its own discussion. But we will talk, and we'll move over to another question now. The question I'm going to go back to the topic of addiction, because that will lead me to the other topics that we need to address here. So, I discussed it briefly in the first session, and I used the Likutei Torah Chukas, which many people commented on and found quite fascinating, that the Koyach HaMesava and the Taiva, the difference between the object of desire and the desire itself. Desire, as he says, is Yisedose B'Harei Kodesh. It's founded in the highest levels, the power of desire. Because that power of desire can be desire for God, it can be desire for divine revelation, it can be desire for so many things. Like I mentioned, the Alter Rebbe had a desire that they thought that the desire was for Melucha, for leadership, and it was a desire for Malchus of Ein Sof, for Malchus of Atzilus. So the root of desire, the fact that we desire something, a soul desires, is a very holy thing. However, when it comes down, Anoshim Ke'akenu, people like us in this world, this desire can manifest in a tzura, in a levush, in a garment, that takes on the shape of something completely inappropriate. Likutei Torah says that you have to burn and eliminate the object of desire, and then you can transform the power of desire. The question was asked to me, do you have to completely eliminate all the negative elements of the desire before you get to the power of the desire? Which can be seemingly the meaning in Likutei Torah. Additional question that was asked addresses a whole other issue of what we call iskafia and ishapcha. So here's the question that was asked. I am currently in the program of recovery from addiction. It's a spiritual program called the 12 Steps. This is the famous 12-step program. One of the things that I'm taught in my program is that it's not enough to white knuckle it. In other words, it's not okay to just abstain from indulging in my addiction. As long as I still have an obsession for that substance, eventually I will fall back into my addiction. So my solution has to also deal not only with my willpower, which is to refrain with my obsession, but there has to be something more. It has to be dealing with the obsession itself. In Tanya, I am taught to practice iskafia. The way I understand that now is simply to abstain from indulging in that substance. However, I don't see where Chassidus addresses my obsession with that substance. Is it fair to say that the Alter Rebbe wants me to fight for the rest of my life by white-knuckling it, or does the Alter Rebbe also give me a way to have some reprieve? So in Perek Chav Zayin, Chav Ches, Chav Zayin, chapter 27, the Alter Rebbe talks about this and says that one of the ways to avoid depression is to know that when you have a challenge, ulai lekach nivra, maybe that's why you were created, to fight. And with that you give great nachas ruach to God. So that may be a good way to keep yourself to refrain. But like the questioner asks, is that lasting? The obsession is still there. It keeps popping up. So literally every day you're knocking it down. Can that last? Which is why I brought up the Likutei Torah, that there's a koyach hamasav. If it was just refraining, and there was no channeling and no redirecting of that passion, it seems almost impossible for a person to sustain that. But then the quest puts in question Tanya. Tanya seems to suggest the war. There's war all the time. Can you fight war 24/7? So, the response that I would like to say to this is the following. In discussing Iskafia and Isapcha, which also touches upon the same idea that we discussed earlier about annihilating yourself or not. Iskafia seems to be, you have to basically give up. Like he says there in Tanya as well. That the mere fact that you don't indulge in a meal is already giving God great pleasure. Correct. But we know there's a concept called Ishapcha, transformation. And we know that the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe and Chabad especially was shalal and negated sigufim, breaking your body, self-oppression, self-infliction, and it was azev tazev imei, to transform the physical, not just to refrain from it. And we know that in a person's work, we don't just say refrain from everything and just give your soul to God. We say do it, find a way that your nefesh habamis is satisfied. Let it be happy. Famous mashal of the Baal Shem Tov, a classic example the Baal Shem Tov gives about the Ben Melech. The king is ailing and aging, and he sees his son who's going to be his heir to the throne, and he's concerned he hasn't earned his way. Because he's been spoiled, he's always lived in the palace, always catered to. So what does he do? He decides to send him away to a distant land where no one recognizes him. Let him live among the subjects. Let him build a sensitivity without being spoiled and protected. But he knows once he goes there, the child will forget. He may assimilate his ways. So that the king decides he'll send the child a letter several times a year to remind him that you're my child and you're being groomed to be the next leader. And that's what happens. It's a painful day when the father sends away the child. He goes to a distant land, and that's what happens. He forgets, but he gets the letter. Every time he gets a letter from his father, several times a year, he remembers who he is. He wants to celebrate. The problem is, with whom is he going to celebrate? The townspeople will say, why are you celebrating? And he'll say, well, I'm the king of the sun. I will one day be your leader. They may be resentful. They may hurt him. So he has a great idea. He announces one day a party, a free party, free cocktails on me. Everyone is celebrating because they're getting free drinks and free food. Meanwhile, he's celebrating because he received a letter from his father. This example is given for drinking mashke, saying l'chaim, but it's also an example in general for Yiddishkeit. Why do we, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, feed the body special foods? Because this is exactly the story. The king is God. The child is the soul. In heaven, a soul is everything is comfortable. You send the soul down to earth where there are challenges to earn its way. But it forgets. Well, as soon as we're born, we forget the Torah that we've studied in our mother's womb. So that God sends us a reminder several times a year, Shabbos, Yom Tov, and so on. The neshama wants to celebrate because it's receiving a message from God. The body is busy with its own things. So God says, you know what? Mitzvah la'ange. It's a mitzvah. Give it pleasure. Give the body food. Give it kishke, kugel, knedlach, kartoffel, everything that starts with a kuf for some reason. And let the body celebrate because it is getting what it needs. Meanwhile, the neshama can celebrate. The problem is, many of us don't know about the message. All we know is about the food and the drink. This is the point. Our point, we definitely satisfy the nefesh habamis. But the point in Likutei Torah Chukas goes deeper. It says that the passion, the passion, the power of the soul, of the animal soul, is actually rooted in a very powerful place in Tayu and higher. And that passion at the root is completely holy. It's just been misdirected. So when exactly you have to begin using that element? You have to eliminate all the negativity in an addiction? Not necessarily. If a person, for example, was addicted to something that's very bad, if you can find the core, what drives them there? They're very creative and they're very high adrenaline. They need excitement. Whatever it may be. They may be addicted to money. They love money. Money can be used for good things. You have to find a way, another principle in Chassidus, that the tree is chopped down by the wood from the tree, to find something, the basis of homeopathy, the basis of antibiotics, to find something in the person that they enjoy, the animal soul even enjoys, and direct it toward a positive thing. So, Tanya says what it says. Well, I'm more than happy to hear people's comments. I think that there's two tracks, because we also have the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov. The Evim Gam Tzmeim, Nafshem Behem Tisatev. So what does the Baal Shem Tov say? That says when a person is drawn to a food, to beauty, even to a color, even to a particular taste, physical taste, is because the soul is being drawn to the sparks in that thing. Now obviously, the animal soul is being drawn, like he says in Tanya, because it's materialistic, it's selfish. But it's rooted in the root of roots in something that is holy, which means that ultimately, ishapcha is possible. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya, I would submit, is dealing with the facts on the ground. How do you begin? You have to self-control. You have to use your mind to control your heart. But then ultimately, there has to be the use of somebody's own talents and direct them in a positive way. So, we have to find it in Tanya where it spells it out more specifically. I will definitely get back and look for more of that. But there's no question, in other places in Chassidus definitely talks about utilizing and transforming, and not just iskafia. There's the famous example. There's two ways to deal with a ganef, with a thief. One is a thief, you catch him, put him in prison. Like the famous story, middle of the night, the thief is coming, and you hear the thief. So you can do is start yelling, and the thief runs away, or you can rehabilitate the thief, which is, of course, what Chassidus ultimately wants. Because as long as the thief is not rehabilitated, he'll come back again. So there's the Mashpir Rab Greinim would use a parable, which is a famous one, of the debate between the sun and the wind, which is more powerful. So they both did their tricks, their magic. They both began to look at a human being who was walking on the earth. The sun began shining heat, and we say, who's going to get the guy to take his coat off? And the wind began blowing strong. The wind began blowing strong. The stronger it blew, the more the person tightened up the coat and wouldn't take it off. The more the sun shined, the more he got hot, warmed, he took off his coat because he was too hot. In other words, the derech of warmth, of going with kiruv, with trying to find a positive element, always has a much more lasting effect. If you go with force, then the resistance is also built. So a famous story of Rabbi Shalom Ber Gordon, Olav Shalom. He asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, what do you do when you meet someone that's doing something that requires rebuke? So the Frierdiker Rebbe said to him, well, to ignore it, you don't want to ignore it. On the other hand, rebuking him may not be appropriate. There's such a mitzvah. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, when you left Russia, you went through Turkey. So the lesson is from a Turkish bath, a schwitzbad. A Turkish bath, the custom is like this. You go into a schwitzbad, a hot bath house. And you go into the bath, the sweat room, the heat and the perspiration starts cleaning out your pores. Then you climb higher because heat rises. So it starts opening up even more pores, and oozing out are the toxins and the other dirt and grime inside the body. And then the custom is in these Turkish baths that you come out and you pay an attendant to slap you with eucalyptic leaves, a broom made of eucalyptic leaves. So Frierdiker Rebbe says that's the lesson. The first thing you have to do is warm someone up. Then you have to elevate them and warm them even more. And then they'll pay you to slap them. In other words, not imposing, it comes from love. That's called ishapcha, as opposed to iskafia. But it's two stages. Discipline is required. The ultimate goal is transformation, which is the whole idea of Mashiach. Now, obviously, this again has to be addressed case by case, and because in each situation, is discipline required now, or is a little more love? But one thing is for sure. It's very clear from a lot of the questions that discipline alone, when it's devoid of love, and actually when it's actually filled with not love, opposite of love, is destructive. It could have all good intentions. But today especially, as I started out earlier in saying, if someone is parents or educators or adults are just disciplining and the person doesn't feel love, what you're doing is breaking a person, demoralizing the person. And that is never a healthy thing. So this leads me to another question. Chinuch, an education question. How should parents react to their 16-year-old daughter from a Chassidic family that do not have a TV and internet when they discover that she has been going to movies? A, punish her. B, show strong disapproval. C, show mild disapproval. D, show no reaction and change the subject. E, other. So I appreciate the thoroughness. Basically I don't think there's another option. So it's a good question, excellent question. Again, every child is different. So what I'm going to say now is a general principle from a Chassidic point of view. And I think it applies to any situation, because remember the audience here, just for the record, has grown. It's not just Chabad in our community. A lot of different people are listening and many questions are coming from all different directions. So this is a very universal question. And using these options, let me go three ways. Your child comes home from school. I'm using my own example. Did something really bad, hurt another child, something serious that can't just be ignored as a small matter. There are three different reactions you'll have from parents. One is the parents who, my child can do no wrong, it's always someone else's fault. It's this other kid's fault, it's the teacher's fault, it's the principal's fault, it's the school's fault, it's God's fault. Always someone else. They refuse to do anything, no discipline. Second option is the other extreme. The parents immediately go ahead and say, how could you do such a thing? They ground the child, discipline, punishment. The child ends up crying, broken, regretful, remorseful, whatever. Both these approaches, as we both can understand, are a problem. One, ignoring it, you can create a monster. There's discipline is necessary. On the other hand, to just discipline and break the child is not a derech, is not an approach. And this brings me to a key principle, which I don't know if we'll have time to talk, we may have to address it next week, which is about depression. Anything that's demoralizing comes from klipa, comes from negative. If someone disciplines you, or you discipline someone, and it demoralizes the person, doesn't motivate them to become greater, it makes them feel worthless, it makes them feel terrible, in a way that they are just feel broken, that's not Kedusha. Kedusha means mirirus, you feel sad, remorse, and it motivates you to be better. So even when there's discipline, the goal of it has to be growth. What's the benefit of just destroying somebody because they did something wrong? Especially when we're dealing with a child. So there's a third option. The third option is you sit down with the child and say, look, you've done something very serious wrong. I love you from the depths of my heart, and that's why I'm saying what I'm saying now. I expected much more from you. Your potential is unbelievable, your soul is unbelievable, but we have to do something, and I want to tell you I'm going to do something that you may not like, but it's a lesson in life, but I want you to know it's coming from the depths of my love for you. I'm not saying the exact words, because I said each child in its own way, and obviously case by case there's some situations where discipline has to be more prominent and the love a little less, but there has to always be a combination. Why don't most parents do this, or educators? Because we're lazy. It's much easier to either ground the child or to ignore it. This requires application, applying yourself, sitting down, takes time. But the lessons and the fruits it yields changes a person forever, because this child will never forget both messages, the love and the expectation. So the rebuke came from expectation, like the other Rebbe said. You warm him, you lift him up, and then he'll ask you to rebuke. Now, in the case of a child, often that may not happen. So let's not go to this girl. There's no TV, there's no internet, movies. My answer, the Chassidic answer is, you have to have a heart-to-heart conversation. Obviously, if you heard about it from other people, it has to be done the right way. That you can't betray anybody's trust. But you have to have a heart-to-heart conversation. It may take a lot more than just one of these two answers. So there is a sixth option: heart-to-heart conversation. If it's a 16-year-old girl, it's no longer a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old. You could say, I don't like what you did, and next time she just won't tell you, or she'll make sure she hides it better. Same thing about reading books, about listening to music. So the approach has to be that yes, your child is growing into an adult and time has come to have some interesting conversation with her or with him. And remember, us parents, we also, what are we, perfect? So maybe it's a conversation, a heart-to-heart conversation. What do you deal when you have challenges like this? And some things you may have to overlook. Some things you have to be stronger on. So I think it's important to realize the child is no longer 5 years old. Now the child is 16, and soon she'll be 20, and then she'll be 25, and one day she'll be married, hopefully very soon, and be with her husband. There's a lot of decisions that are coming up. I think this is an opportunity. I see it as a gift that she did that. Why? Not a gift per se, but because it's an opportunity, address it. And I think this needs a sophisticated and mature approach where, I don't know if it's about particularly one movie, maybe it's in general about how we entertain ourselves, what we explore. But I definitely would not go into hand-wringing mode and say, oy vey, look what happened to my daughter. And either go into this extreme discipline. It's not about you, the parent. It's about the girl. It's about the woman. It's about the man, whoever it is. Care, love, and obviously a lot has to do with how your relationship is with this child before this happened. If till now the relationship has not been good, then suddenly you're going to say, you know what, I don't like this. You're not going to get very far. However, if you have a very good relationship with a child, and we'll talk about this more in future episodes or sessions about preemptive issues. So this has a lot to do with what your relationship with your child is. But it definitely has to be more than just a quick fix, that either total discipline or so on, because it's not necessarily going to work. And you have to also know what the child is made of. If you know your child is going to do it anyway, and they're very, very interested, creative, they like to read, they're curious, they're looking and so on, to just cut off and say, you know what, I forbid it, it goes back to the ganef. Yeah, you may stop him for a few years, but you haven't really resolved the issue. And that's why it requires a far more in-between type of approach. Because of time limitations and trying to keep this to an hour sessions, there are some questions I was going to address. I will simply have to address them in the following. There's some fascinating things I was going to share. A letter from the Rabbi that was recently discovered that really gives an insight, a tremendous insight in this regard about how to utilize a nefesh habamis, a passion that could go one way and utilizing it another way. And some more very interesting stuff. And I want to say that the topic of depression and anxiety I will have to address next week, as well as some other things we were going to address as intimacy, other types of therapy, and a few other interesting stuff. Some of the more sensitive matters I'm saving for future weeks because I want to cover some more basic material. But it's again an honor to share a few words, and hopefully this has been helpful. Please keep the questions coming. Feel free to comment on everything we've been saying here. And everything is open, just like I'm suggesting things, you can feel free to suggest other options. Rebut it is an open type of forum and discussion. And may we make the Rebbe proud, make the Rabbeim proud, take Chassidus, take Torah, and let it live up to its true legacy of actually transforming our lives, refining our lives to be the healthiest possible people, healthiest fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, grandparents, and children, that we can march to Mashiach with a healthy body and a healthy soul inside of a healthy body in the fullest integrated and seamless fashion. So until next Sunday, I bid you a very good week.